So I'm just going to do a bit of a demo and talk through some of the stuff I've found, sort of putting together the work around the GitHub feed type, and then looking at, basically as a backstory, with the GitHub feed available, I was kind of looking for a good use case to kind of demo an end-to-end deployment using, you know, a non-build type product. And so what I've done is I've taken the AWS Lambdas, and I've put together some build steps around it, so that way that research can feed into our work on AWS as that's going. So I'll do a bit of a demo first, and then just sort of talk through some of the things that I've found, etc. So I've got a Lambda set up, and it's going through API Gateway to expose it to the world. And as you can see, it's just a really simple blob of JSON that gets exposed. So what we'll do is we will update it. So instead of red, we want it to be blue. So I've got that sitting in a GitHub feed, just a personal GitHub feed at the moment. So I'm going to add that change. And so with the new GitHub feed, everything, the versions are effectively based off tags. So what will happen is when you tag a commit, and that's available in GitHub, when you look for packages through Octopus, it effectively tries to parse those tags, and if they're valid Semver, it treats them as package versions. On top of that, if you've got a release which is tied to that, tag, any release notes you've got in that release will sort of come along for the ride as well. I'm not going to bother much around with releases at the moment because that's need to go into GitHub to do that. So let's tag this. Okay, so we're going to push it up. In this case, we don't have any build necessary because we're just pushing out this Lambda. As a disclaimer, potentially when you're doing the using Lambdas, you might still need to do builds if you've got external dependencies, etc., and you still need the package that gets pushed to AWS still needs to have all those dependencies available, etc. It doesn't do npm install. So if we go across to Octopus now, I need my trace. Okay, so we've pushed that up. So now that'll be available in GitHub. And so I've set up what I wanted to do is have the ability so that when I pushed a tag through GitHub, I wouldn't need to go into Octopus and create a release for it and deploy a release, etc. So I wanted to start leveraging ARC. Now, obviously, we don't have ARC for external feeds at the moment. So to get this to work, I ended up cobbling together a second AWS Lambda, which basically received the webhook invocations from GitHub, converted it into something that Octopus could use, and then I push it down to my local server. So it's kind of a double step hop that would be nice to remove at some point, but we'll talk about that later. But that way I can just push that tag and bang, I've got a deployment that kicks off. It's now available in development. So if I go to development and refresh that, what you'll find is that's now just got that updated change I made with blue. But if you keep refreshing it, we'll see sometimes it triggers between red and blue. And that's because of a feature in Lambdas that I'll point out shortly. And that just kind of allows you to effectively sort of canary your changes. So you can configure that so that, 50% go to one, 50% go to the other, or obviously any value in between. And what I've done as part of this deployment, if we look at the actual process, is I've broken that up into two steps. So the first one will push the Lambda, and the second one updates that weighting, basically. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about what exactly it is that I'm updating in a second. But basically, we update it to 50%. We check that we're all happy with it. In this case, I've got a manual intervention that sort of sits there and waits and goes, hey, make sure you're happy with the changes. Yes. and then that'll kick off the second update wait step to push it to 100%. So by having these two steps separated, one which is basically push and update Lambda, and the other one is to update the weights, it'll allow us to kind of do these, canary deployments or stage rollouts, and the users might push that up in 5% increments with, some weights in between, or we might end up having an even bigger and better step that they might want to build that run some API tests in between, or whatever kind of makes sense. It kind of creates that distinction between pushing it and actually, making it live and everywhere in the world. Now, in theory, when I go to that, I'm always getting that blue. So that's kind of pushing that package through from GitHub using a kind of a pseudo ARC to automatically create the release in Octopus and pushes it up to the Lambda with some weights. So I'll talk through now some of the stuff in terms of how that actually works in Lambda and some of the ways that potentially we can leverage those weightings in canaries. So I'll go through a bit of a slideshow, because who doesn't love a slideshow? AWS Lambda, cool. So basically within a Lambda, when you've got your function, all the work and all the changes you do is always on what they call the latest, version. So it's kind of similar to a GitHub-y type world where every time you make changes, that changes is made to latest, or like the head. And whenever you're happy with it, what you do is you publish it. And so you publish your version, and that becomes then sort of an immutable version that sits there, and you keep publishing and making changes. So those versions there, these are some immutable sort of instances of that function. You can hit any one of those versions directly and sort of invoke what the function was at that point in time, or you can hit it at latest. Because that changes quite a lot though, as you keep pushing the version, you probably want to have something a little bit more static to call, right? So what they've got is these concepts called aliases. So in AWS, which I will show in a minute, you basically configure an alias in your Lambda, and you go, I want this alias to point to version 1, and I might want this other alias called development to point to version 4 and 3, and I want the traffic to be distributed sort of accordingly. And the nice thing about that is then you can sort of change between what those aliases point at and your endpoints, because those aliases will sort of just flow through to whatever version you've got there. So then the question is, okay, so how do you actually hit it from the outside world? So as a bit of a disclaimer, Lambdas themselves are just functions, obviously, as you all know, that run in AWS, and you could trigger that by HTTP request, or that might be something that triggers from an internal AWS event. So it might be a new S3 event that triggers it, or anything really. There's about 100 different ways to trigger it. But if you want to hit it via the HTTP endpoint, what you typically need to do is set up something through the API gateway. So what the API gateway offering is a service where basically you configure your API, you configure a whole bunch of resources, and each one has a different HTTP verb. And each one of these resources you configure to be, when I hit this endpoint, I want to process the request, push it to, might be Lambda, or again, anything inside AWS. And when the response comes back out, do something else with it. When you're configuring these resources, what the API gateway has is a concept called deployments. So again, in a kind of similar but not similar way to aliases that you've got in Lambdas, API gateway has these deployments. They're the ones that you actually hit. These deployments are the ones that have publicly available URLs, which actually they're called stages, so they're not deployments. So they've got these stages that you, when you make a change to your resource, you deploy it to one of your stages. So the question then is, okay, so with the stages in the API gateway, how do we actually hook that up and point it to the different Lambdas that we've got available, and how would that work with Octopus where we want to deploy between prod and staging and dev and all that? So One thing that API Gateway actually also has is the concept of canary. So this is a case where you've got those weightings inside Lambdas themselves underneath the aliases, but then you've also got within API Gateway the concept of canaries. And obviously with anything in AWS, there's about 101 ways to skin a cat. So a lot of the stuff that I've found here is based on blogs that people have done about how they approach it, and a lot of the different ways that you can sort of deal with this deployment strategy. So in one case, you've got these stages. And so I might deploy my discount check to the prod stage. And within that prod stage, I can configure a what they call a canary. And what that means is you can configure certain properties in it to effectively be different to the primary one. By default, when you create it, everything is exactly the same, but you can configure different properties on it. You configure the distribution weightings. So what that means is when you actually do your deployment from your resource across to your canary, so in this case, let's say we want to deploy 2.0, we've now got the prod one running and you've got the canary running, and they basically when you hit that traffic, when you hit that endpoint, you get that traffic distribution, some going to the new, some going to the old. And as you keep updating that canary, you'll keep getting those changes pushed through, but obviously the prod doesn't update until you finally go, yep, I'm happy with 2.1, so 100% of my traffic goes to 2.1. So that's just kind of to show how the API Gateway and Lambdas have a similar sort of concept in terms of canaries and distributed deployments, distributed releases. So in terms of integrating that with the Lambdas, so when you configure your resource, you configure your endpoint discount check, you can configure it to point to a specific Lambda. So that might be a case where we've got the staging. So this is where we're using an alias. It could be pointed at one of the specific versions you've got, or it could be basically just goes to latest if you haven't provided that final piece. What I've done in this case though to get the to work with Octopus is leverage something that they call stage variables. So in this case, the discount check API endpoint, the endpoint that it hits relies on some variables that come from the staging environments. So what that means is then when I configure in AWS a staging and a production alias, deployment, sorry, I can give them a Lambda alias in the staging variables, and that means each one of those ones will go to a different one of those aliases we've configured in AWS, in the Lambdas. So again, if I change prod around, when I do that deployment through Octopus, I'm effectively just changing these aliases here and leaving the staging, the stages effectively pointing at those aliases. That way the API Gateway doesn't need to change. So this is the simplest kind of approach where the API Gateway doesn't need to be changed. You configure that once. And what we're actually doing is configuring the Lambdas. Another approach you can do is where you actually have completely separate, and that some people have sort of taken this approach, is we have completely separate Lambdas. One that you might have all your staging deployments changes in, one that has all your prod. And so as you test and update your staging one, when you're happy with it, you effectively mirror those changes across to the prod Lambda. And so what that means is your two stages in API Gateway hit two completely distinct Lambdas. On top of that, then you can also have the canary stages as well. So you can kind of get almost like a double weighted effect going on. A little bit excessive, but there we go. So basically what's come out of that is the realization that we kind of want two steps to get this approach working, where you have one which is deploy, one which is just the aliases. I might actually just have a quick, if I can exit that, I'll give you a quick look at the Lambdas themselves just to make some of that maybe sink in a little bit better rather than just me waffling away. So in this case, if we look at the actual Lambda that I'm deploying to as part of this deployment, you can see here we've got all these versions, and the version numbers themselves are just auto-incremented by AWS, but what you can do when you create those versions, so when you effectively make a change, you publish your version. So that's like, making a commit, so to speak. You give it a description. So in our case from Octopus, I've just given it a description based on the release. That's not really that important. What I've also got is the environment variables themselves also get pushed up from Octopus as part of that deployment. And then your aliases. So within the aliases, we've got a development and a staging one. And as you can see, your development one at the moment is pointed 100% at 45, version 45, but we might want, 12% to go to 42. So it's by adjusting these numbers that those steps are effectively operating on the Lambdas within Octopus. To quickly run through API Gateway, and obviously this is a very high level. I'm by no means an expert on either of these, so feel free to call out anything that looks like I'm making stuff up. So within our resource, we've got an endpoint which we just call it. It's the get verb, and so this is where we've defined the Lambda that we want to point to. So as you can see here, we're using a staging variable that we're going to pull out of the stage effectively that gets hit. So when we publish that resource, you can publish it to one of your stages. In the case of the development stage, we have the stage variables. And again, this is where that value comes from. So each of these stages will have different variables that you can pass in that help configure your resource and allows it to sort of differ between the stages. And in the case of the staging one, we've actually got a canary set up as well, where we have a 50-50 split between the canary and the default stage. And just for the sake of it, 50% of the requests to the staging endpoint are going to go to the development one, just for the hell of testing. So that's just a kind of a look at those steps that we've got that you've already seen. So there's nothing new there. And in terms of just some ideas on how that step might look, effectively, a lot of the existing stuff we've got for AWS would be pretty much as is. You pick your region, you got to pick your account. The difference might be you pick your function. This would probably be a drop down where we populate it based on hitting the actual AWS endpoints themselves, just to make it a little bit more user friendly. But of course, if you wanted to go to that approach where you have completely different Lambdas for completely different environments, then perhaps you would bind that to a variable and you can define that how you want. So the idea is to make these steps flexible enough so that if any one of the half dozen different ways you want to use Lambdas and do these stage rollouts to fit your sort of scenario, kind of just works.
Would the Lambda function not be a target rather than a variable?
Well, the Lambda function itself can be a target. So this itself might hit the target, so you could do it that way as well. It's more that if we wanted to allow them to do
target different Lambdas easily in different environments, then it would just work.
If that's what you wanted, like if you wanted to have a completely different Lambda for different environments, then yeah. And then you've got the environment variables that get pushed in, and then there's a whole bunch of other various bits and pieces that we might want to expose for configuration. Similarly, on the updating the aliases, that's just a matter of accessing the version that gets published as part of as part of a pushing to Lambda. What you'd end up getting is an output variable, which is the version, because every version is kind of different and just provided to you by AWS. So then you would use that version when you're doing the weighting changes. So you'd say update my dev alias and give it the new version and weight it to 32% or whatever. So that's kind of how it kind of feels like a natural fit with Octopus in terms of being able to do these stage deployments through the various different environments. The weightings feels like a nice added little benefit to allow people to do those canary deployments as well. It's probably not necessary if you're using API Gateway and you've configured your own weightings over there, but that might even end up being another step we deal with sometime down the track. By just focusing on Lambdas at the moment, we can work on one target at a time, I suppose, rather than trying to do everything in one hit. So just in summary over what sort of I just demoed there, the GitHub feed types. I'm going to start merging some of that in, although I might hide some of it away, so that way when we do the 2018 3 release, we can kind of make a bit of make a bit of a scene about it. But most of it is fairly disconnected because it's just a new feed type. Most of it is fairly disconnected from everything else anyway. It's more of an additional change than anything that will have any effect on existing code. As you may have seen on the Gantt chart, we're looking at getting S3 out for this month, probably. Focus on getting that out. Because at the end of the day, these Lambdas, although in this case, I'm sourcing the Lambda from the GitHub feed as a package, and of course it could be a package from anywhere, potentially one of the use cases might be to source it from an S3 bucket, which is another valid way of accessing Lambdas. So once we've got the S3s in there, we can look at how that would fit in with the Lambda steps. And then also, just as a bit of a down the track thing, we've started some discussions around how we might handle external feeds and auto release creation. In the case to get this to work, it was quite a bit of a hack around and quite a dirty Lambda just to basically just to listen to the GitHub webhooks and then forward them on to Octopus. But that just doesn't feel like a nice way to tell users if you want to auto deploy stuff that isn't coming from the built-in feed, you need to deal with it yourself. And I think ultimately, if we're trying to make Octopus kind of one of their key premier tools in their automated deployment chain, it feels like being able to actually deal with external feeds and reacting to them is something we need to look at. So some specs, or just some ideas, I suppose, for that are out in the specs area. And depending on feedback, we might end up having a Friday feature discussion, or we might do that once we've had a proper talk about its first steps. So yeah, so that's what I have put together. Happy to get some input on, Rob, you don't understand how AWS works, you're completely wrong, go home, or yeah, whatever. Comments, thoughts? Does it make sense to approach the Lambdas as a valid set? It feels like kind of a nice, natural next step on top of some of the ones we've got already. And it would be good to go towards the AWS Summit with something more in our hands rather than just here's some steps, run PowerShell and cobble together a configuration, which were essential first steps, don't get me wrong. But yeah.
Can you just go back to that mock-up you had of the deployment?
This one?
No, it might be, there was another one.
That one.
No, maybe the one below.
The weighting change?
Yeah, that one. So we are basically calling aliases environments. Is that how we are mapping the terminology?
Yeah, to an extent. So that's how I've basically modeled it for this particular, like just for this test, mucking around with it, where the aliases are basically environments. And so that way that becomes the one that you point to. The only caveat with using a single function that makes me kind of think that we probably need to make sure we do support separate functions entirely for different environments is the fact that with Lambdas, there's just one Lambda there. And so every time you make a change, so let's say we want to deploy this to staging now, you effectively got to potentially update your environment variables or whatever it is, whatever the other pieces are that you need that differ between environments. And latest is always just going to be whatever the last one is that you push there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it seems like there's two ideas of environments here. You've got aliases, or the API gateway also kind of has that idea as well.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm just wondering how we represent that. Yeah, how we map that to our idea of environments.
Yeah, so the two options that the users could model that is they could have completely different Lambdas as the different environments, and in that case, you would that's just a script step, but in the push step, you would either have a function which is sort of a version, a variable which has, that changes between environment or a target.
Yeah, but not or. Definitely a target.
I think you potentially want to allow them to put it in there.
Right? I don't think so. I think that these would always be targets. The different environments approach seems a much better approach, because I imagine you would want different permissions on your.
I think that would probably end up being the most likely one.
Aliases seem much more designed for versioning than for environment.
That's right, yeah. And I think having the different functions are probably going to be the more stable approach. So
in that case, we'd be opinionated about how that deployment goes ahead.
I think we definitely want to make these things first-class targets. I mean, that's where everything's, where all depends.
Yep.
Yeah. If you really wanted to use the same one in multiple environments, then we currently support today putting a target in multiple environments, so that would work as well. But it's not the normal way of doing it.
I'm just blurring the idea of a promote, you can do it the other way, right?
It really is.
Right, it's not really moving something from one place to another, it's just shifting weighting something, which doesn't quite feel right.
Mm-hmm. No, and I mean, people, I think, have a pretty big difference between a production and their testing environments. Just doing it with a label doesn't feel...
Yep.
I wouldn't be comfortable with that.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is, like I was saying, because there's within a function, you've kind of got one. If you wanted to use that alias approach, you effectively got to make sure you make appropriate changes before you publish them. So yeah, having them as separate version, having separate functions as the different environments is probably the more natural, or the safest, I suppose, is a better word approach.
Mm. Yeah, there's less that can go wrong.
Mm-hmm. And it fits nicely with our model of everything else as well, I think.
I think there's probably still room for supporting them if you're trying to smoke test during the development of dev.
Completely.
The equivalent to kind of what you would use slots for in an Azure web deployment, right?
Yeah.
You can run it up to the staging slot, check that it looks okay, then flip it.
That's right.
That's a deployment into one environment. They're not two environments.
Yep, and that's why I think we can. I can't see why we wouldn't be able to build these to sort of handle both. But when we talk about this is a scenario how you use Lambdas, we would focus on set them up separately. So our tutorials would be set up two separate ones, set up your targets, da 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 da. But given how it all works, I don't feel like that, I don't think that'll hem us in to not also allowing the other approach or allowing you to use aliases.
Rob, quick question. I suppose people, when they start with Lambda, they just use one or two functions, but then when they write something bigger, they need to deal with tens of functions. Mm-hmm. Would we handle that in an easy way for them?
Well, each one would be a different function. I'm not sure.
So imagine you have 50 functions. Yeah. So do you ask me to create 50 resources manually and create 50 steps?
So at the moment, for the sake of this step anyway, I didn't even bother trying to do a create if it doesn't exist. That might be something we want to do, but I mean, that's kind of what the cloud formation stuff is for as well. You might potentially use that to set up all 50 of them, and then you've got your different steps.
Yeah, no, setup is one thing, but then the deployment. So can you deploy 50 of them from a single package? Basically?
You can, but I think they tend to recommend to keep them separate. Ultimately, if you're using if it's a different function, then you still need to push the package. Even if you're using the same package, you'll need to push it up twice, which is not bad either. Or reference the same S3 bucket. So that's achievable too.
Okay.
Right. I wonder if the newly released deploy release step might come into its own here, where you have these super projects like a Voltron project that deploys your hand-picked 50 different versions of your functions. Mm-hmm. The different versions of the 50 functions. But I guess there's some interesting questions around, would you have one repository per function, which may seem like overkill in certain scenarios, or would you have a single repository that has all your functions in it, and therefore the tags, you have that same problem that we had with Tentacle and Octopus where they were in lockstep.
Yeah, so what you can do is with the packages that you push up, basically when you define your specific function, you give the entry handler, like the entryway point. And so in this case, it's index handler. The handler in this case is defined by the runtime, because obviously if I'm using the, I know C# one, it's not going to be .js. But you could have that one package that has all of them in it, push that one up to S3, and then you'd have 10 different functions all referencing the same package, but you might have a different handler for each one.
Yeah, so one of the reasons you would like to keep them separate is, one of the reasons people use Lambda is to pay as little as possible. So you load only what you need. It doesn't mean the functions are not tightly coupled. Very often they are. It's more what you run. So if I need to load all my code, even if I execute 150 of it, that might be.
I mean, a lot of that comes down to the individual users, how they see things. I mean, I think in the ideal world, you'd have a different package, different, everything different per function, just that way, you've got a different release cadence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But
yeah, what I'm saying is they might be tightly coupled, which means they have to live together. They just don't want them to run together because they just, let's say I know they never run at the same time.
Yeah, and that's right. And because AWS, again, it's like that Swiss Army knife. They support any configuration, any of these different permutations you want. And I don't think there's any reason that we can't sit on top of that.
What's your thought there, Pavel? Are you thinking maybe if there are multiple things in there, we're going to find it by convention or something like that to save you having to set up individual steps, maybe let you wildcard things? Or
I don't really have any particular solution in place. It's more that I have a zip file with functions in it, let's say 50 function, and if we can come up with a convention, I don't know, one top level folder per function or something similar.
The difficulty with trying to be too magic is then we still need to consider, keep in mind that when you're configuring functions, you still need to configure things like the roles that it runs on, network details, etc. So again, unless we also have all them by configuration or the same type or whatever, that still needs to be factored in.
I wonder in that case, Pavel, if you just end up with a big CloudFormation template
and
deploy them all.
That feels like the nicest start point, right? Like that'd be your first.
CloudFormation is never a nice start. Yeah, it's just an idea. That's all.
Or even I would see it more as a potentially the transient environment configuration. When you're setting up your transient environment that has all these lambdas in it, it would configure and set up these lambdas with all the right configurations, and that might be empty to begin with. It'll set up the targets in Octopus, and then when we start deploying through that environment, it just picks up the right ones and goes. So think of it more of a setting up your environment more so than every time you deploy.
Yeah, the setup is one thing. It's the deployment of the code then. Mm-hmm. That's all. Yeah, the setup, yeah, sure. It's like, the way I see it's dealing with AWS functions is the same way we deal with Azure websites. You have to set up the website and you deploy DLL. It just, in that DLL, you can have thousands of functions. So that's not a problem. You deploy just one thing. If we want to be more granular with AWS functions, I don't want to deploy them one by one or configure them possibly one by one. That's all.
Sure.
Great stuff, Rob. That was excellent.